The hospital hummed with energy as the morning shift began. Mia Johnson walked through the main doors, her scrubs crisp, her ID badge glinting in the light. Her dark curls were tied back neatly, and her confident smile masked the butterflies in her stomach. She was used to starting over. It came with being a black woman in healthcare, navigating workplaces that were often wary of her presence. As Mia approached the nurse's station, she noticed Dr. Robert Hayes for the first time. His tailored white coat and perfectly combed hair gave him a commanding presence, but his icy demeanor immediately set her on edge. "Good morning, Dr. Hayes," Mia said warmly, extending her hand. Dr. Hayes glanced at her hand briefly before nodding curtly. "Nurse Johnson," he said. His voice clipped, and turned away without shaking her hand. Mia stood frozen for a moment, her smile faltering. Nearby nurses exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. Mia drew a deep breath and steadied herself. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to save lives. In the staff locker room, Mia unpacked her bag, organizing her tools and reviewing her notes. A seasoned nurse, Ellen, approached her, adjusting her badge. "First day?" Ellen asked, offering a smile. "Yes," Mia replied, forcing a grin. Ellen leaned closer, her voice low. "You'll do fine, but watch out for Dr. Hayes. He's a piece of work. Just keep your head down." Mia raised an eyebrow. "Thanks for the heads up, but I'm not one to keep my head down." Ellen chuckled nervously. "Suit yourself. Just don't say I didn't warn you." Later that morning, Mia found herself in the cafeteria, sipping coffee and reviewing her assignment. Across the room, Dr. Hayes sat with another doctor, his expression serious. Mia couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language was unmistakable. "She's not what I expected," Dr. Hayes muttered, stirring his coffee absently. Dr. Caldwell, his companion, frowned. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," Hayes replied, glancing toward Mia. "This hospital prides itself on standards. I'm not sure she fits." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. "She's new. Give her a chance." Hayes didn't respond. He sipped his coffee, his jaw tight. The staff meeting room buzzed with chatter as the chief of medicine entered, clipboard in hand. "All right, let's get to it," she began, her tone brisk. "We've got a critical case in the ICU, and I'm assigning Dr. Hayes and Nurse Johnson to lead." Murmurs rippled through the room. Dr. Hayes stiffened, his jaw clenching visibly. "Chief," he began, "I think another pairing might be more effective." The chief raised an eyebrow. "Dr. Hayes, you've worked with plenty of new staff. Nurse Johnson comes highly recommended. Are you questioning my judgment?" Hayes hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course not," he said finally. Mia sat quietly, her face calm but her mind racing. The tension was palpable, and she knew it would be up to her to prove herself. In the ICU ward, Mia introduced herself to the team. Her confidence seemed to catch some of them off guard. Dr. Hayes stood to the side, his arms crossed, watching her like a hawk. "Patient in room 5, Mia said, her voice steady. "Oxygen saturation dropping. We need to adjust ventilation and monitor for fluid buildup." "Is that your assessment?" Dr. Hayes asked sharply. "Yes, doctor," Mia replied, meeting his gaze. Without a word, Hayes turned to the team. "Let's move," he barked, as though he hadn't heard her. Mia stood by the patient's bedside, analyzing the charts. "I recommend adjusting the dose of diuretics to manage fluid retention," she said. Dr. Hayes barely glanced at her. "Not necessary," he said curtly, turning to the team. "Follow the standard protocol." Mia bit her tongue, reminding herself to pick her battles. She documented her recommendation in the patient's chart, just in case. Later that afternoon, a nurse struggled with a difficult insertion. Mia stepped in, her hand steady and precise. "There," she said, securing the line flawlessly. The nurse smiled gratefully. "Thanks, Mia. You're a lifesaver." Dr. Hayes watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. During a brief break, Mia entered the staff lounge. Finding Dr. Hayes seated with a coffee, she decided to try again. "Long shift," she said lightly. Hayes didn't look up. "They usually are," he replied. Mia sighed inwardly. If he wasn't going to make an effort, neither would she. The patient in room 5 took a turn for the worse. As alarms blared, Dr. Hayes called for immediate action. "Increase oxygen flow," he ordered. "It's fluid overload," Mia said, her voice urgent. "We need to adjust the diuretics now." For a moment, Hayes hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. Finally, he nodded. "Do it," he said reluctantly. Within minutes, the patient stabilized. The team exchanged relieved glances, but Hayes avoided looking at Mia. That night, Mia sat in her small apartment, jotting down notes in her journal. Her handwriting was neat, each word purposeful. "Day 1, she wrote, "met resistance as expected. But I'm here for the patients, not the approval. Tomorrow is another chance to show them who I am." She closed the journal and leaned back, her resolve solidifying. Whatever Dr. Hayes thought of her, she wouldn't let it define her work. Morning rounds. Mia arrived early. As always, her uniform immaculate, and her tablet loaded with patient updates. She had reviewed every case for the day, determined to stay ahead. Dr. Hayes entered moments later, his usual aura of authority intact, though his expression darkened when he saw her. The ICU ward was bustling as the day began. Patient in room 12, recovering from surgery, Dr. Hayes began, addressing the team during rounds. "We'll keep standard monitoring." Mia cleared her throat. "Doctor, his blood pressure remains low despite fluids. I suggest running a lactate test to check for sepsis." Dr. Hayes's gaze swept over her, sharp and dismissive. "Noted," he said curtly, before continuing his report as if she hadn't spoken. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, but Mia stood her ground, making a note to check the test herself. Later, when the lactate results confirmed early sepsis, Dr. Hayes quietly authorized treatment without acknowledging Mia's foresight. A subtle snub in the conference room, the ICU staff gathered for a training session on new technology for patient monitoring. The trainer, a representative from the manufacturer, welcomed input as he explained the features. Mia raised her hand, asking insightful questions about the device's integration with current systems. Her questions earned a nod of approval from the trainer. "That's a great point, Nurse Johnson," he said. "This system does allow for customized alert thresholds." Dr. Hayes sat at the back, arms crossed, his face unreadable. After the session ended, he approached the trainer. "You'll find that not everyone here fully understands the bigger picture," he said, his voice low but cutting. Mia overheard but chose not to react. Instead, she focused on the trainer's instructions, determined to master the technology. Gossip in the cafeteria during her lunch break. Mia joined a table of nurses she had started bonding with. They were warm and welcoming, though the topic of Dr. Hayes quickly soured the mood. "He's impossible," one nurse whispered, "but he gets away with it because he's brilliant." Mia sipped her coffee, letting them vent. "I don't care how brilliant he is," she said finally. "A good leader knows how to bring out the best in the team, not tear them down." The nurses nodded, though one warned, "Careful, Mia. He doesn't take well to being challenged." "I'm not here to challenge him," Mia replied firmly. "I'm here to help patients. That's all that matters." A public disagreement. The ICU was tense as Mia and Dr. Hayes assessed a post-surgical patient showing signs of respiratory distress. "We need to intubate," Dr. Hayes said decisively, reaching for the kit. Mia frowned, reviewing the patient's vitals. "With respect, doctor, I think it's premature. Non-invasive ventilation might stabilize him without added risks." Dr. Hayes shot her a cold look. "This isn't a debate, Nurse Johnson." But as the team prepared for intubation, the patient's breathing began to improve under Mia's suggested intervention. Dr. Hayes said nothing, moving on to the next case. But the ICU staff exchanged knowing glances. Family matters later that afternoon. A distraught family member of a critically ill patient stormed into the ICU, demanding answers. Dr. Hayes' attempt at an explanation came off clinical and cold, escalating the situation. Mia stepped in, her tone calm but empathetic. "I understand how worried you must feel," she said gently. "We're doing everything we can, and I'd be happy to walk you through the treatment plan." The family member's anger softened under Mia's approach. Dr. Hayes watched silently as she de-escalated the situation. When the family left, he muttered, "That was unnecessary," before walking away. A tense the break room felt unusually quiet as Mia entered to grab a cup of tea. Dr. Hayes sat at the table, scrolling through his tablet. She decided to make an effort. "Busy day," she said, keeping her tone light. He didn't look up. "It always is," he replied curtly. Mia leaned against the counter. "You know, Dr. Hayes, we're on the same team. It might help if we acted like it." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I'll keep that in mind," he said dryly, returning to his work. Mia sighed, realizing the conversation was over before it had begun. Crisis mode alarms blared in the ICU as a patient went into cardiac arrest. The team sprang into action, but confusion erupted as staff scrambled to find the cause. Mia scanned the monitors and shouted, "Pulmonary embolism! We need a thrombolytic immediately." Dr. Hayes hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Do it." The team worked seamlessly under Mia's direction, stabilizing the patient. After the crisis passed, Dr. Hayes quietly said, "Good call," before walking away. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd received from him. A heated confrontation as the day wound down. Mia overheard Dr. Hayes speaking with another doctor near the ICU doors. "She thinks she knows everything," he muttered, his voice low. Mia stepped forward. "Excuse me, Dr. Hayes, but if you have a problem with me, I'd prefer you address it directly." The air grew tense as his colleague excused himself awkwardly. Dr. Hayes crossed his arms. "You're overstepping, Nurse Johnson. And you're underestimating me," Mia replied firmly. "I'm not here to fight with you, Dr. Hayes, but I won't apologize for doing my job well." For once, he had no retort. Reflection at home. Mia replayed the events of the day in her mind. She felt a pang of doubt. Was she pushing too hard? But then she remembered the patient's recovery and the family she had comforted. "Focus on the work," she whispered to herself. "The rest will follow." Small wins the next morning. Mia arrived early, as usual, to prepare for the day. As she reviewed the updated patient charts, she noticed something surprising. Dr. Hayes had followed through on her recommendations from the previous day. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The ICU buzzed with urgency as an ambulance brought in a high-profile patient. Senator John Whitaker. Media vans were already gathering outside the hospital, eager for updates. Mia quickly read through the patient's chart as the paramedics rattled off vital stats. Dr. Hayes arrived moments later, immediately taking command. His face was impassive, but his tone carried an edge. "This is a politically sensitive case. No room for mistakes." Mia nodded, her focus unwavering. "Senator Whitaker is exhibiting signs of acute respiratory distress. We'll need to stabilize him immediately. Standard oxygen therapy," Dr. Hayes ordered. Mia glanced at the oxygen levels on the monitor and spoke up. "Doctor, with his condition, we risk fluid overload. I recommend CPAP therapy to avoid invasive measures if possible." Hayes hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "We'll discuss later. For now, follow the protocol." Mia clenched her jaw but complied. The tension between them was palpable, and the staff worked silently, exchanging wary glances as the team prepared for what was shaping up to be a challenging case. Hours later, Mia was briefing the senator's family in a private waiting area. She carefully explained the treatment plan, ensuring they understood the steps being taken to stabilize him. The family nodded, their worry evident. but Mia's calm demeanor seemed to reassure them. Just as she finished, Dr. Hayes entered the room. He cut her off mid-sentence. "I'll take it from here," he said, his tone dismissive. Mia stepped back, fuming silently as Hayes repeated much of what she had already explained, but with a colder, more clinical tone. The family's confidence visibly waned. Afterward, as they walked back to the ICU, Mia confronted him. "Dr. Hayes, I was handling that. Your interruption wasn't necessary. It's my responsibility to communicate with the patient's family," he replied sharply. "Let's keep our roles clear." Mia stopped in her tracks, staring at him with disbelief. "My role is to care for patients, Dr. Hayes. That includes their families. Whether you like it or not, we're a team." He didn't respond, but his jaw tightened as he walked away. The ICU quieted during the lull between emergencies. Mia sat at the nurse's station, reviewing the senator's labs. A group of nurses nearby whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward Dr. Hayes' office. "Do you think he's deliberately trying to undermine her?" one nurse asked softly. "Of course he is," another replied. "He doesn't like her. It's obvious." Mia cleared her throat, and the group fell silent. She turned to them with a calm expression. "Gossip doesn't help anyone. Let's focus on the patients." As the nurses dispersed, Mia returned to her work, but the sting of their words lingered. She hated feeling like the center of a controversy she hadn't asked for. The senator's condition worsened that afternoon. His oxygen levels plummeted, and alarms blared. The ICU team rushed to his bedside, with Dr. Hayes barking orders. "Prepare for intubation," he commanded. Mia quickly reviewed the patient's chart and vitals. "Dr. Hayes, I still think CPAP therapy could work. Intubation carries more risks at this stage." Dr. Hayes glared at her. "We don't have time for hypotheticals, Nurse Johnson." "It's not hypothetical," Mia shot back. "The senator's vitals suggest." "Enough," Hayes interrupted. "Do your job." Mia stepped back, biting her lip as the team followed Hayes' instructions. The procedure was grueling, and the senator's vitals fluctuated dangerously before finally stabilizing. Afterward, Hayes avoided Mia's gaze as he updated the family. Mia documented her original recommendation in the patient's chart, refusing to let her voice go unheard. Mia stayed late that evening, reviewing the senator's progress. She noticed subtle improvements in his vitals, confirming that her earlier recommendation might have worked just as well, or even better. As she walked through the quiet ICU, she found Dr. Hayes sitting alone in his office, staring at the senator's chart. He looked up when she knocked lightly on the doorframe. "What is it, Nurse Johnson?" he asked, his voice weary. Mia hesitated before stepping inside. "I just wanted to say that I know we both want the best for our patients." "I'm not your enemy, Dr. Hayes." He frowned, his gaze dropping back to the chart. "Good night, Nurse Johnson." Mia left, feeling like she'd taken one step forward and two steps back. The next morning, the senator's wife approached Mia near the nurse's station. "I just wanted to thank you for your kindness," the woman said, her voice trembling. "You've been a calming presence during all of this. We appreciate it more than you know." Mia smiled warmly. "It's my job to care for both the patient and the family. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Dr. Hayes walked by just in time to hear the exchange. His expression was unreadable, but he lingered at the station longer than usual before moving on. The ICU faced an influx of emergencies later that day, pushing the team to their limits. Mia and Dr. Hayes found themselves side by side as they managed critical patients. Despite their differences, their actions synchronized seamlessly, stabilizing one patient after another. For the first time, Dr. Hayes seemed to genuinely acknowledge Mia's skill. "Good work," he said quietly after they successfully handled a particularly challenging case. Mia glanced at him, surprised, but didn't let the moment distract her. "Thank you, doctor," she replied simply, before moving on to the next task. As the ICU quieted for the night, Mia found herself in the break room, sipping tea. Dr. Hayes entered unexpectedly, his usual stern expression softened by exhaustion. "You were right about CPAC therapy," he said abruptly. Mia blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me? I reviewed the charts," he continued, his tone reluctant. "It would have worked. I should have listened." Mia set her cup down, her heart pounding. "Thank you for saying that, Dr. Hayes." He nodded briefly before leaving. It wasn't much, but it was the first real step toward mutual respect. The next day, Mia found a note on the senator's chart. It read, "Follow Nurse Johnson's recommendations for respiratory therapy." She stared at the note for a long moment before tucking it back into the folder. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing she'd ever seen from Dr. Hayes. As the senator's condition improved, the ICU staff noticed a subtle shift. Dr. Hayes no longer dismissed Mia's suggestions outright, and the tension between them seemed to ease, if only slightly. Mia knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time she felt like progress was possible. The day began with a staff meeting in the ICU conference room. As the team reviewed cases from the previous week, Dr. Hayes stood at the front, presenting a critical analysis of the ICU's performance. His tone was authoritative, his gaze sweeping the room with an air of expectation. When Mia offered a suggestion for improving patient monitoring, Dr. Hayes interrupted her mid-sentence. "That's not relevant to the current discussion," he said sharply, his voice echoing in the silent room. Mia froze, the sting of his words palpable. Around the room, nurses and residents exchanged awkward glances but remained silent. She felt the weight of their eyes on her as she sat back in her chair, her face a mask of calm even as her hands clenched beneath the table. After the meeting, Ellen, one of the senior nurses, whispered, "Don't let him get to you, Mia. We all saw what happened." Mia forced a tight smile. "It's not about me. It's about the patients. That's what matters." But deep down, her confidence wavered. Later that day, Mia stood outside the chief of medicine's office, her heart pounding. She had debated this decision for days, but after the public dismissal and repeated undermining, she knew she couldn't remain silent. Inside, the chief greeted her warmly. "Mia, what can I do for you?" Mia took a deep breath. "I'd like to formally file a complaint against Dr. Hayes for creating a hostile work environment." The chief's expression shifted, her brow furrowing in concern. "I see. Can you provide specific examples?" Mia detailed the incidents, from dismissed recommendations to public criticisms. The chief listened intently, taking notes. "I understand your concerns," she said finally, "but I urge you to consider mediation first. Dr. Hayes has been with this hospital for years, and while he can be difficult, he's not malicious." Mia's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Chief, it's not about his intentions. It's about his actions and the impact they have on patient care." The chief nodded thoughtfully. "Understood. I'll review this and take appropriate action." As Mia left the office, she felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She knew she had done the right thing, but she also understood the potential fallout. The tension in the ICU was palpable the next morning. Word of Mia's complaint had spread quickly, and the staff seemed split. "Honestly, I think Mia's brave," one nurse whispered in the break room. "Someone needed to stand up to him." Another nurse frowned. "Sure, but he's brilliant. We can't afford to lose him over a personality clash." Mia entered the room mid-conversation, the chatter halting abruptly. She pretended not to notice and grabbed her tea, but the weight of their divided loyalties hung over her like a cloud. That afternoon, an elderly patient's condition deteriorated rapidly. Mia and Dr. Hayes rushed to the bedside, the tension between them momentarily forgotten in the chaos. "Vitals are dropping," Mia reported. "We need to stabilize him before administering pressors." Dr. Hayes nodded. "Agreed. Prepare the line." For the next 30 minutes, they worked side by side, their movements seamless despite the unspoken strain. When the patient finally stabilized, Dr. Hayes glanced at Mia, his expression unreadable. Good work, he said quietly. Mia didn't respond, focusing instead on updating the patient's chart. She couldn't let herself believe that one moment of cooperation would change everything. As Mia stepped out of the ICU, she heard Dr. Hayes' voice behind her. Nurse Johnson, a word, he called. She turned to face him, her posture straight and professional. Yes, Dr. Hayes? His face was tight with frustration. I assume you filed a complaint against me. Mia met his gaze evenly. I did. And you didn't think to discuss it with me first? He asked, his voice low but sharp. I've tried discussing things with you, Mia replied, her tone calm but firm. You dismissed me every time. Filing the complaint was my only option. Dr. Hayes exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. You're making this personal. No, doctor, Mia said evenly. You did that. I'm here for the patients, and I won't let anything, not even your behavior, compromise their care. Dr. Hayes stared at her for a moment before walking away without another word. That evening, the chief of medicine called both Mia and Dr. Hayes into her office. The atmosphere was icy as they sat across from each other, avoiding eye contact. I've reviewed the situation, the chief began, her tone measured. Mia, your concerns are valid, but Dr. Hayes has a long history of excellence here. I propose a mediated discussion to resolve this. Mia folded her hands in her lap, her voice steady. I'm open to that, Chief, but only if Dr. Hayes acknowledges the issues and commits to addressing them. Dr. Hayes bristled. I don't see how this affects patient outcomes. We're both professionals. Let's focus on the work. The chief's expression hardened. It affects everything, Dr. Hayes. This hospital thrives on teamwork. If this isn't resolved, it will jeopardize the quality of care we provide. Reluctantly, Dr. Hayes nodded. Fine, I'll participate. Mia simply nodded, though her resolve remained unshaken. The tension escalated further that night when a patient went into cardiac arrest. The ICU team scrambled, with Mia and Dr. Hayes both taking charge. Clear the airway, Dr. Hayes barked. Administer AP, Mia countered, focusing on the heart rhythm. Despite their differences, their combined efforts brought the patient back from the brink. As the team caught their breath, the ICU fell silent. Dr. Hayes glanced at Mia, a flicker of something, respect, in his eyes. Good teamwork, he said reluctantly. Mia gave a curt nod. For the patient's sake. Mia returned home late, collapsing onto her couch. The weight of the day pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She replayed every interaction with Dr. Hayes, wondering if she could have handled things differently. Her journal lay open on the coffee table, and she picked up her pen. Today was hard, but the patient survived, and that's what matters. I'll keep pushing forward, no matter how many walls stand in my way. She closed the journal and leaned back, her resolve stealing once more. The next morning, Mia found a note in her locker. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Your quick thinking saved a life yesterday. Thank you. Mia stared at the note for a long moment, her chest tightening. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to one she'd received from Dr. Hayes. She tucked it into her bag, unsure what to make of it. By the end of the week, Mia and Dr. Hayes sat down for their first mediation session. The room was quiet, the tension thick. I've made mistakes, Dr. Hayes admitted grudgingly, his gaze fixed on the table. But I value the work we've done together. I'd like to move forward. Mia took a deep breath. I appreciate that, Dr. Hayes, but actions speak louder than words. I need to see real change, for me and the team. The mediator nodded. That's a good starting point. Let's build on this. As they left the room, Mia felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. The ICU ward was quiet as the sun crept over the city, casting long shadows through the hospital windows. Mia arrived early, as usual, but the weight of the mediation session still lingered in her mind. She prepared her station, meticulously checking supplies and reviewing patient charts. hoping to anchor herself in routine. Dr. Hayes walked in minutes later, his usual brisk pace carrying him directly to the nurse's station. "Update on the senator's condition?" he asked curtly, not looking up. Mia replied evenly, "Vitals stable overnight. Oxygen levels have improved with non-invasive ventilation." He paused, glancing at her. "Good." It was a single word, but it carried an unfamiliar tone, something closer to acknowledgement than dismissal. Mia didn't respond, choosing to focus on her work. She wasn't ready to let her guard down yet. Later that morning, the ICU admitted a 19-year-old college student, Jake, with multiple organ failure stemming from a rare autoimmune condition. As Mia reviewed his labs, her heart sank. His condition was critical, and the family's faces, worn and tear-streaked, were etched with fear. Dr. Hayes joined her at the bedside. "This is going to be a marathon," he said, his voice softer than usual. Mia nodded. "We'll need to manage fluids carefully to avoid worsening his condition. I'd recommend starting with low-dose steroids and plasmapheresis." To her surprise, Hayes didn't argue. "Agreed. Let's get the team moving." For the next several hours, they worked in tandem, stabilizing Jake and communicating updates to his family. Despite the tension that still simmered between them, their coordination was seamless, driven by the shared urgency of saving a life. As the day wound down, Mia was organizing charts at the nurse's station when Dr. Hayes approached. He cleared his throat, his demeanor uncharacteristically hesitant. "You handled the situation with the boy's family well," he said. Mia looked up, startled. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes." For a moment, he lingered, as though he wanted to say more. Then he nodded and walked away. It was the first time he had praised her without reservation, and though it was a small gesture, it stayed with her. In the staff lounge, Mia sat with Ellen and a few other nurses during a short break. The conversation drifted toward systemic challenges in healthcare, particularly the biases faced by minority professionals. "You know," Ellen said, stirring her tea, "it's not just about individual attitudes, it's the whole system." Mia nodded thoughtfully. "True, but changing one mind can create ripples. I don't think Dr. Hayes is beyond change. He just hasn't had a reason to see things differently until now." One of the younger nurses leaned forward. "Do you really think he'll change?" Mia smiled faintly. "People are more than their worst moments. I have to believe that, or what's the point?" Jake's condition took a sudden turn for the worse in the middle of the night. His blood pressure plummeted, and his oxygen levels dropped dangerously low. Mia and Dr. Hayes were called in from their respective breaks and rushed to his bedside. "Cardiac tamponade," Mia said, her voice calm but urgent. "We need to drain the fluid around his heart." Dr. Hayes nodded. "Prep the pericardiocentesis kit." The procedure was intense, but their combined focus and precision paid off. Jake's vitals stabilized, and the room erupted in quiet relief. Afterward, as they cleaned up, Dr. Hayes glanced at Mia. "Good call, Nurse Johnson." "Thank you, Dr. Hayes," Mia replied, meeting his gaze. This time, it felt like more than a professional exchange. It felt like mutual respect. The next morning, Mia found herself in the break room again, this time alone. She stared into her tea, reflecting on the previous night's events. Dr. Hayes entered quietly and sat across from her. He held a coffee mug but didn't drink from it. "You've been right more often than I've been willing to admit," he said, breaking the silence. Mia looked up, surprised. "That means a lot, Dr. Hayes." He hesitated, then said, "My father was a doctor. He believed in rigid hierarchies in perfection, and he made it clear that people like you didn't belong in this field." Mia's chest tightened, but she kept her tone steady. "And do you believe that?" "No," he said after a long pause. "Not anymore." They sat in silence for a moment before the intercom summoned them back to the ICU. During a lull in the day, the ICU team gathered in the lounge to celebrate Ellen's 20th anniversary at the hospital. There was cake, laughter, and stories shared about her years of service. Mia noticed Dr. Hayes standing near the back, observing quietly. She approached him, holding 2 slices of cake. "Celebrating doesn't hurt," she said, offering him a plate. He took it with a small smile. "I'm not much for parties." "Maybe not, but you're part of this team. And teams celebrate together." For the first time, he stayed for the entire gathering, joining in the applause as Ellen shared her gratitude. That evening, Mia was called to the chief's office unexpectedly. As she stepped inside, she saw Dr. Hayes sitting across from the chief, his posture unusually relaxed. The chief smiled. "I just wanted to commend you both for the extraordinary teamwork you demonstrated with Jake's case. It's a prime example of what this hospital stands for." Dr. Hayes glanced at Mia, nodding slightly. "Nurse Johnson deserves the credit for identifying the issue." Mia felt a flicker of surprise but responded graciously. "It was a team effort, Chief." As they left the office, Mia said quietly, "Thank you, Dr. Hayes." "You've earned it," he replied simply. Mia returned home that night, exhausted but content. She opened her journal and began to write. Today, something shifted. Dr. Hayes isn't just tolerating me anymore. He's listening. It's a small step, but it's progress. Change isn't easy, but maybe it's possible. She closed the journal and looked out her window at the city lights, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The next day, Mia arrived early as usual. Dr. Hayes was already there, reviewing charts. "Nurse Johnson," he said without looking up. "Yes, Dr. Hayes? I've recommended you for the ICU mentorship program. The team could use more leaders like you." Mia froze, the words sinking in. "Thank you. That means a lot." He finally looked at her, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You've earned it." As she walked to her first patient of the day, Mia felt lighter. It wasn't the end of their challenges, but it felt like the beginning of something better. The staff gathered in the hospital auditorium, murmuring quietly as they awaited the introduction of the new head administrator, Sylvia Crane. Known for her strict policies and no-nonsense demeanor, she had a reputation for prioritizing efficiency over empathy. Mia sat near the back, her notebook open on her lap. Dr. Hayes was seated a few rows ahead, his posture stiff. The chief of medicine stepped up to the podium. "I'm pleased to welcome Sylvia Crane to our hospital," she began. "Her expertise will guide us into a new era of operational excellence." Sylvia took the stage, her sharp suit and piercing gaze commanding attention. "Thank you, Chief. This hospital has a strong reputation, but there's always room for improvement. My goal is to ensure that every minute, every dollar, and every action taken here contributes to measurable outcomes." Mia frowned slightly. Her words were polished, but there was no mention of patient care or staff well-being. Dr. Hayes glanced back at her briefly, his expression unreadable. The next morning, Sylvia Crane unveiled a series of new policies in a staff meeting. Charts were distributed, outlining stricter protocols for time management, resource allocation, and patient discharge efficiency. For example, Sylvia explained, "No patient should occupy an ICU bed for more than 72 hours unless absolutely necessary. We need turnover to maximize our resources." Mia raised her hand. "With respect, some patients require longer stays to recover fully. Forcing them out too soon could jeopardize their health." Sylvia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Your concern is noted, Nurse Johnson, but we're focusing on what's best for the hospital as a whole." Dr. Hayes leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Pushing turnover without considering individual cases undermines our ability to provide quality care. I'd suggest revisiting the benchmarks." Sylvia's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she replied, "Duly noted, Dr. Hayes." As the meeting ended, Mia caught up with him in the hallway. "Thank you for speaking up," she said. He nodded. "Some policies need to be challenged. This is one of them." In the ICU, the impact of the new policies became evident almost immediately. Nurses were rushing to meet tighter schedules. Doctors were juggling more cases than usual, and patients were being transferred prematurely to make room for new admissions. Mia found herself at odds with Sylvia's rules daily. One afternoon, she stood at the nurse's station, arguing with the transfer coordinator. "This patient isn't stable enough to leave the ICU," Mia said, pointing to the chart. "The new policy says." "I know what the policy says," Mia interrupted, her tone firm. "But policies don't treat patients. People do." Dr. Hayes approached, scanning the chart. "I agree with Nurse Johnson. Delay the transfer until the patient is stable." The coordinator hesitated. "I'll need to get approval." "Then get it," Hayes said sharply. Mia gave him a grateful nod. "Thanks." "Don't thank me," he replied. "It's the right thing to do." That evening, Mia found Dr. Hayes in his office, reviewing a stack of charts. She knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Busy?" she asked. "Always," he replied without looking up. She stepped inside and sat across from him. "How are you holding up with all these changes?" He glanced at her, surprised by the question. "It's frustrating. Crane's policies are undermining the work we've built here, and I've spent most of my career following rules. But these," he trailed off, shaking his head. "They're not about patience," Mia finished for him. He nodded slowly. "Exactly." For a moment, they sat in shared silence, the weight of the situation heavy between them. The hospital hosted a community health fair that weekend, and both Mia and Dr. Hayes volunteered to provide consultations. The event was bustling with activity, families lining up for free checkups and health advice. Mia worked tirelessly, her warmth and energy drawing patients to her booth. Dr. Hayes observed her from his own station, noticing how effortlessly she connected with people. As the day wound down, a young boy approached Dr. Hayes, holding his mother's hand. "Thank you for helping my dad," he said shyly. Dr. Hayes knelt down to the boy's level, his usual stern demeanor softening. "You're welcome. Your dad is very brave." Mia watched the interaction from a distance, smiling to herself. Maybe he was learning to let his guard down after all. Back at the ICU, a patient's condition deteriorated rapidly. It was one of the cases Mia had argued to keep in the ICU, but under Sylvia's rules, the patient had been transferred to a general ward too soon. Now the patient was back, worse off than before. Mia worked furiously to stabilize her while Dr. Hayes coordinated with the team. "Damn these policies," Hayes muttered under his breath as he adjusted the ventilator settings. When the patient finally stabilized, Mia looked at him, her exhaustion mirrored in his eyes. "We can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "We won't." The next morning, Mia and Dr. Hayes met with the chief of medicine to discuss the impact of Sylvia's policies. "These rules are putting patients at risk," Mia said, her voice steady but passionate. "We've already seen preventable complications and unnecessary readmissions." Dr. Hayes added, "If we continue on this path, it's only a matter of time before something catastrophic happens. We need to prioritize patient outcomes over metrics." The chief sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Sylvia's policies are controversial, but she has the board's backing. I'll do what I can, but my hands are tied." Mia left the meeting feeling deflated, but Hayes placed a hand on her shoulder as they walked out. "Change takes time," he said. "Don't lose hope." That evening, the ICU team gathered for an informal meeting. Mia stood at the center, addressing the group. "These policies are making our jobs harder, but we can't lose sight of why we're here. If we stand together and advocate for our patients, we can push back against the changes that don't work." Dr. Hayes stepped forward. "Mia's right. We've seen the consequences of these decisions, and it's our responsibility to speak up, for the patients and for each other." The team nodded in agreement, their unity strengthening under the shared challenge. Over the following weeks, Mia and Dr. Hayes worked together to compile data on the negative outcomes caused by Sylvia's policies. They presented their findings to the board, their arguments backed by statistics and patient stories. Sylvia was visibly displeased during the meeting, but the board members seemed receptive. We'll review these findings and discuss potential adjustments, the chairman said. It wasn't an outright victory, but it was a step in the right direction. After the board meeting, Mia and Dr. Hayes stood outside the hospital, the evening air cool and refreshing. You were impressive in there, Hayes said, his tone genuine. Coming from you, that means a lot, Mia replied with a smile. He hesitated before saying, You've taught me a lot, Mia, about patience, leadership, and myself. She looked at him, surprised. Thank you, Dr. Hayes. That means a lot. As they parted ways, Mia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were far from over, but she knew she wasn't facing them alone. The ICU buzzed with activity as Mia prepared for her shift. A new hire, Amanda Stevens, was being introduced to the team. Fresh out of nursing school, Amanda was eager but visibly nervous. Her pale complexion flushed red as she struggled to figure out the electronic charting system. Let me help, Mia said, stepping up beside her. Her tone was calm, her movements deliberate as she explained the interface. Amanda's shoulders relaxed as she followed Mia's guidance. Across the room, Dr. Hayes observed the interaction. When Amanda walked away to join her mentor for the day, he approached Mia. You have a way of making people feel at ease, he said. Mia raised an eyebrow, surprised by the compliment. Thank you, Dr. Hayes. It's part of the job. It's a skill, not just part of the job, he added before walking away. By the afternoon, Amanda's initial nervousness had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence. However, during a routine patient handoff, Mia overheard Amanda making a dismissive comment to another nurse about an elderly black patient. They probably didn't even understand half of what we said, Amanda murmured under her breath. Mia's stomach tightened. She approached Amanda later, pulling her aside in a quiet corner of the ward. I heard what you said earlier, Mia began, her tone firm but composed. Amanda frowned. What do you mean? Mia didn't mince words. The comment you made about the patient was inappropriate. Everyone deserves respect and dignity, no matter who they are or where they're from. Amanda flushed. I didn't mean anything by it. Intent doesn't erase impact, Mia replied. We're here to help people, not judge them. Let this be a learning moment. Amanda nodded slowly, her embarrassment clear. Across the room, Dr. Hayes observed the exchange, his expression contemplative. Later that day, Mia led a training session for a group of new nurses. The topic was cultural competence in patient care, a subject Mia was deeply passionate about. As she spoke, the room grew quiet, her words resonating with everyone present. Our patients come from all walks of life. It's our responsibility to meet them where they are, to listen, to empathize, and to provide care that respects their individuality. Dr. Hayes entered the room midway through the session, standing quietly at the back. He listened intently as Mia shared stories from her own experiences, illustrating the importance of understanding cultural nuances. When the session ended, Dr. Hayes approached her. That was insightful, he admitted. Thank you, Mia replied, noticing his uncharacteristic hesitation. I'd like to incorporate some of these ideas into our staff meetings, he added. Mia blinked, surprised. I'd be happy to help with that. The ICU faced a surge of admissions that evening, testing the limits of the team's coordination. Mia and Dr. Hayes worked in tandem, their movements synchronized as they triaged patients. When a particularly complex case arose, a young mother with severe postpartum complications, they seamlessly alternated between tasks. We'll need to intubate, Hayes said, his voice calm but urgent. Mia prepped the equipment without hesitation, offering suggestions as they worked. She's showing signs of DIC, Mia noted. We should start a heparin drip once she's stable. Hayes nodded. Good call. When the patient stabilized hours later, the team let out a collective sigh of relief. Hayes turned to Mia. That was excellent work, he said, his voice genuine. Mia met his gaze, a small smile tugging at her lips. Teamwork makes the difference. During a quiet moment, Dr. Hayes and Mia found themselves alone in the break room. Hayes sipped his coffee, his gaze distant. "My father was a surgeon," he began suddenly. "He had this unshakable belief in hierarchy. He used to say that respect was earned, not given." Mia watched him carefully, sensing the vulnerability in his words. "Do you agree with him?" she asked softly. "I did," he admitted, "for a long time. But you've shown me that respect isn't about hierarchy. It's about humanity." Mia felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. For the first time, the distance between them seemed to shrink. The following week, Mia and Dr. Hayes were asked to mentor a group of interns. The session focused on managing high-pressure situations in the ICU. Hayes began the session, outlining the technical aspects of critical care with his usual precision. Then Mia stepped in, sharing insights about the importance of empathy and communication. The interns were captivated by their dynamic, watching as the two leaders complemented each other's approaches. At the end of the session, one intern remarked, "You two make a great team." Mia glanced at Hayes, who gave a rare smile. "We've had practice," he said. Not all moments were harmonious. During a staff meeting, Mia and Hayes clashed over a proposed change to the ICU's workflow. "With all due respect, Dr. Hayes, this change prioritizes speed over quality," Mia argued, her voice steady but firm. Hayes leaned forward, his expression intense. "And quality means nothing if we lose patients due to delays." The room fell silent as the two debated, each presenting compelling points. Afterward, Hayes approached Mia. "You made valid arguments," he admitted. "I'll reconsider the proposal." "Thank you," Mia replied. "We're both fighting for the same thing. We just see it differently sometimes." The ICU celebrated a milestone, a month with 0 preventable complications. The team gathered in the lounge, toasting their success. Mia found herself standing beside Hayes as the chief of medicine gave a congratulatory speech. "This success is a testament to teamwork and leadership," the chief said, glancing at both Mia and Hayes. As the applause filled the room, Hayes turned to Mia. "We couldn't have done this without you." Mia smiled. "And I couldn't have done it without you." That evening, Hayes approached Mia with an idea. "I've been thinking about starting a mentorship program for young doctors, focusing on cultural competence and communication. Would you consider co-leading it with me?" Mia's eyes widened in surprise. "I'd be honored," she said. Hayes nodded, his expression serious. "Good, because I think we can make a real difference." As the shift ended, Mia and Hayes walked out of the hospital together. The evening air was cool, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "You've changed my perspective," Hayes said, his voice low. Mia glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "And you've shown me that people can grow, even when it seems impossible." They parted ways at the parking lot, the respect between them now mutual and undeniable. It began with a phone call late at night. Mia was just settling in with a book when her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed hospital administration, and her stomach twisted. "Hello?" she answered. "Mia, this is Sylvia Crane," the administrator said curtly. "I need to inform you that a malpractice claim has been filed against Dr. Hayes. Effective immediately, he's suspended pending investigation." Mia gripped the phone tighter. "What's the accusation?" Sylvia hesitated. "It's regarding a delayed diagnosis in the Senator Whitaker case. The patient's family alleges negligence." Mia sat in stunned silence after the call ended. She knew the claim wasn't true. Hayes had made the correct decisions, albeit under immense pressure. Still, the situation would inevitably disrupt the ICU's delicate balance and her growing partnership with him. The next morning, the ICU was abuzz with speculation. Nurses exchanged furtive glances, and conversations halted whenever Mia entered the room. "Do you think he's guilty?" one nurse whispered. "I mean, he's always so sure of himself," another replied. "Maybe it finally caught up with him." Mia felt anger rising in her chest. She stopped at the nurse's station, her voice steady but commanding. Dr. Hayes has been an integral part of this team, and this investigation hasn't proven anything. Let's focus on our work instead of spreading rumors. The group fell silent, chastened, but Mia could still feel their doubts lingering in the air. Mia found herself called to a meeting with Sylvia Crane and the hospital's legal team. They wanted her to provide insight into the Whitaker case and Dr. Hayes' actions. Did Dr. Hayes delay critical treatment? Sylvia asked pointedly. Mia met her gaze, unwavering. No. Every decision he made was based on the patient's condition and the information we had at the time. If anything, his leadership ensured the senator's survival. The lawyer interjected. But there's a pattern of behavior, isn't there? Dismissive of input, rigid in his methods. Dr. Hayes has his flaws, Mia admitted, but negligence isn't one of them. If anything, this case reflects the pressures we face under the policies you've implemented. Sylvia's lips thinned, but she didn't respond. That evening, Mia visited Dr. Hayes at his home. He answered the door in casual clothes, his usual composed demeanor replaced by exhaustion. Mia, he said, surprised, what are you doing here? I came to check on you, she replied, stepping inside, and to tell you that I defended you in the meeting today. He sat heavily on his couch, rubbing his temples. I don't know if it will make a difference. They're looking for someone to blame, and I'm the easiest target. Mia sat across from him. You're not going through this alone. I'll fight for you. Hayes looked up, his eyes softening. Thank you. That means more than you know. With Hayes suspended, the ICU struggled to maintain order. His temporary replacement, Dr. Morgan, was competent but lacked Hayes' decisiveness and experience. When a patient coded unexpectedly, the team faltered, unsure of how to proceed. Mia stepped in, issuing orders with confidence. Prepare for defibrillation. Administer AP. Let's move. The team followed her lead, and the patient stabilized. Dr. Morgan approached her afterward. Thank you for taking control. You handled that perfectly. Mia nodded but felt the weight of the situation. Without Hayes, the ICU was vulnerable. Determined to clear Hayes' name, Mia spent her evenings reviewing records and gathering testimonials from staff. She reached out to the Whitaker family, who had initially praised Hayes' care. When she spoke to the senator's wife, the woman seemed confused. We didn't want to file a claim, she said. Our lawyer insisted, but we never blamed Dr. Hayes for anything. Mia felt a surge of hope. Would you be willing to share that with the hospital's legal team? The woman hesitated, then nodded. If it helps, yes. The ICU was pushed to its limit when a multi-vehicle accident brought in several critically injured patients. Without Hayes, the team was disorganized, and mistakes began to pile up. Mia took charge, delegating tasks and coordinating care with precision. We can't afford errors, she told the team firmly. Let's stay focused. Hours later, when the chaos finally subsided, the staff gathered around Mia. You've kept us together, Ellen said. We couldn't have managed without you. Mia felt a swell of pride but also a deep ache. The ICU needed Hayes, and she was determined to bring him back. Mia and the senator's wife met with the hospital board, presenting evidence that exonerated Hayes. Mia's voice was calm but passionate as she outlined the steps Hayes had taken during the Whitaker case. Dr. Hayes saved the senator's life, she concluded, and this claim should never have been filed in the first place. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. Finally, the chairman spoke. We'll review this evidence immediately. Thank you, Nurse Johnson. 2 days later, Hayes walked into the ICU, his white coat crisp and his expression unreadable. The staff greeted him with cautious smiles, but Mia was the first to approach. Welcome back, she said, her voice warm. He looked at her for a long moment. I heard what you did for me. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, she replied. We're a team. That's what we do. For the first time, Hayes smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile. That evening, The ICU team held an informal gathering to celebrate Hayes' return. There was laughter, food, and a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been present in weeks. As the night wound down, Hayes stood to address the team. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "but this experience has taught me the importance of leaning on others and trusting the people around me. Thank you, all of you, for standing by me." Mia raised her glass. "To teamwork and resilience." The room erupted in applause, and as Hayes met Mia's gaze across the table, there was an unspoken understanding between them. The ICU buzzed with activity as the shift began. Mia was training Amanda, the new nurse, on managing multiple patients during busy hours. Amanda's improvement over the past few weeks was noticeable. As they finished, Amanda paused. "Mia, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Mia replied. "You've handled so much here. Difficult cases, tough decisions, even standing up to Dr. Hayes. How do you keep going?" Mia smiled thoughtfully. "Because it's not about me. It's about the patients, the team, and what we can achieve together. If you focus on that, you'll always find a reason to keep going." Across the room, Hayes overheard their conversation. Though he didn't say anything, his expression softened. He was beginning to see how Mia's leadership was creating a ripple effect throughout the ICU. Later that morning, Hayes summoned Mia to his office. "I've been working on something," he said, gesturing to a draft on his desk. Mia leaned over, reading. It was a proposal for a mentorship program aimed at fostering leadership and cultural competence in the hospital. "I think this could make a real difference," Hayes said, "but I'd like your input and your help leading it." Mia looked up at him, surprised. "You want me to co-lead this with you?" "Who better?" Hayes replied. "You've been shaping the culture here since you arrived." Mia smiled. "I'd be honored. Let's do it." The next day, Mia and Hayes presented their mentorship program proposal during a hospital leadership meeting. Mia outlined the program structure, emphasizing the importance of inclusivity and empathetic leadership. Hayes followed, his tone reflective. "This isn't just about improving care. It's about building trust, both within our teams and with our patients." The room fell silent as the board absorbed their presentation. Then the chief of medicine nodded. "This is exactly what we need. Consider it approved." As they left the meeting, Hayes glanced at Mia. "I couldn't have done that without you." Mia grinned. "Good thing we're a team." Mia and Hayes organized a community health event as part of the new mentorship program's launch. The event focused on providing free checkups and health education for underserved populations. Mia was in her element, connecting with patients and answering questions with warmth and clarity. Hayes, initially hesitant, found himself drawn into conversations with families, surprising even himself with how natural it felt. At the end of the day, a young girl hugged Hayes. "Thank you for helping my grandma," she said shyly. Hayes knelt down, his voice soft. "She's lucky to have you looking out for her." Mia watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride. Hayes was finally letting his humanity shine through. Back at the hospital, the chief of medicine called Mia into her office. "Mia, I've been observing your work, and I think it's time for you to take on a formal leadership role. I'd like to promote you to nurse manager." Mia was stunned. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," the chief said with a smile. "You've earned it." As Mia left the office, she bumped into Hayes. "What's that look for?" he asked, noting her dazed expression. "I just got promoted," she said, still processing. Hayes smiled. "Congratulations. You deserve it." As nurse manager, Mia introduced new initiatives to improve communication between nurses and doctors. She also implemented regular feedback sessions to ensure every voice was heard. Hayes, who initially balked at the idea of feedback sessions, found himself appreciating them. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted to Mia one afternoon, "but these sessions are actually useful." Mia smirked. "Told you so." Their camaraderie had grown into a genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to excellence. The hospital celebrated its 50th anniversary with a gala event. Staff, Patients and community members gathered to honor the milestone. During the event, the chief of medicine gave a speech. Tonight, we not only celebrate our history, but also the people who make this hospital extraordinary. Two individuals, in particular, have transformed our ICU into a model of collaboration and compassion. Nurse manager Mia Johnson and Dr. Robert Hayes. The room erupted in applause as Mia and Hayes were called to the stage. Hayes leaned over and whispered, "Looks like you're stuck with me in the spotlight." Mia laughed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The mentorship program officially launched, and Mia and Hayes hosted the first session. The room was filled with young nurses and doctors eager to learn. Mia began, sharing her journey and the challenges she had faced. "Leadership isn't about having all the answers," she said. "It's about listening, learning, and lifting others up." Hayes followed, sharing his transformation. "I've learned that the best leaders aren't afraid to change. Growth is uncomfortable, but it's necessary." The room was silent, the weight of their words settling over the group. One evening, Hayes mentored a young doctor struggling with his biases. "I used to think like you," Hayes admitted, "but someone challenged me to see the world differently. It's not easy, but it's worth it. For your patients and for yourself." The young doctor nodded, clearly moved. As Hayes left, he found Mia waiting outside. "You're turning into quite the mentor," she teased. Hayes shrugged. "I had a good example." Months later, Mia walked through the ICU, observing the seamless teamwork among the staff. The mentorship program had fostered a culture of respect and collaboration, and the difference was palpable. She found Hayes in his office reviewing charts. "You've changed this place," he said as she entered. Mia smiled. "We've changed it." As they stood in the quiet office, looking out over the bustling ward, they knew their legacy would endure, shaping the hospital for years to come. It was a crisp morning, and the hospital staff gathered in the main lobby for the unveiling of a plaque commemorating excellence in patient care and leadership. The chief of medicine stood at the podium, her voice clear and proud. "This plaque honors two individuals who have redefined what it means to lead with integrity, compassion, and vision," she announced. Nurse manager Mia Johnson and Dr. Robert Hayes have set a standard that will inspire generations to come. The plaque bore their names alongside the phrase, "For exceptional contributions to patient care and mentorship." Mia stood beside Hayes, her heart swelling as applause filled the room. She caught Hayes's eye, and he nodded, his expression soft with gratitude. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Hayes murmured as the crowd began to disperse. "What's that?" Mia asked. "Being part of something bigger than ourselves." Mia smiled. "It's about time we embraced it." Mia's first initiative as nurse manager was a leadership development program for aspiring nurses and doctors. Her vision was simple: equip the next generation with tools for empathy, cultural competence, and resilience. During one of the program's workshops, Mia guided a discussion about dealing with difficult colleagues. "When I started here, I worked with someone who didn't believe in me," she said, her tone light but reflective. Hayes, sitting in the back, smirked slightly. "And how did you handle them?" he asked, feigning innocence. "I showed them what I was capable of," Mia replied with a sly smile. The room erupted in laughter, and even Hayes couldn't help but chuckle. As part of their mentorship program, Mia and Hayes invited community leaders to a hospital forum. The event aimed to address disparities in healthcare access and create partnerships between the hospital and underserved neighborhoods. Mia moderated a panel discussion, skillfully navigating tough questions and heated exchanges. Hayes spoke about the importance of trust in medicine, sharing his personal journey of growth. By the end of the event, several community leaders had pledged to collaborate with the hospital. Mia and Hayes stood together, watching as connections were formed. "You're good at this," Hayes said quietly. Mia glanced at him. "We're good at this." One evening, Hayes stayed late, reviewing patient outcomes from the mentorship program. Mia walked into his office holding 2 cups of coffee. "Burning the midnight oil?" she asked, setting one cup on his desk. Hayes gestured to the charts. These results are incredible. Complication rates are down, patient satisfaction is up. This program is working. Mia sat across from him, a warm glow of pride spreading through her. It's amazing what happens when people feel supported. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I never imagined I'd be part of something like this. You've earned it, Mia said. Every bit of it. A year after launching their mentorship program, Mia and Hayes hosted a reunion for past participants. The room was filled with vibrant young professionals who had gone on to make significant contributions to healthcare. A former mentee approached them, smiling broadly. I just wanted to say thank you, she said. Your mentorship changed my entire perspective on leadership. Hayes looked genuinely moved. You did the work, he replied. Mia added, We're proud of you. Keep paying it forward. As the event ended, Hayes turned to Mia. This is our legacy. Mia nodded. And it's just the beginning. One evening, Mia was recognized at a national nursing conference for her contributions to healthcare leadership. Hayes attended the ceremony, sitting in the front row as Mia took the stage. In her acceptance speech, Mia reflected on her journey. Leadership isn't about perfection. It's about progress, about learning from our mistakes and using those lessons to make a difference. I'm grateful to everyone who's challenged and supported me along the way. As she stepped off the stage, Hayes met her with a handshake. That was inspiring, he said. Coming from you, that means a lot, she replied, her eyes glinting with humor. One day, Hayes was approached by the chief of medicine about taking on a broader role in hospital leadership. He was hesitant, unsure if he wanted to step away from the ICU. Mia found him in the break room, lost in thought. Penny for your thoughts? She asked, sitting beside him. The chief wants me to take on an administrative role, he admitted. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Mia smiled. You're more ready than you think. You've already proven you can lead with heart and vision. The ICU will always be here, but this is your chance to make an even bigger impact. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. You always know what to say. Hayes accepted the position, and the hospital hosted a farewell party to honor his time in the ICU. The room was filled with staff and patients whose lives he had touched. Mia gave a heartfelt speech. Dr. Hayes taught us all that leadership is about growth, about being brave enough to change and wise enough to listen. We'll miss him in the ICU, but his legacy will continue to guide us. When it was Hayes' turn to speak, he looked directly at Mia. If I've learned anything, it's that the best leaders are those who inspire others to be their best. Mia Johnson, you've been that leader for me. The room erupted in applause, and Mia felt a lump rise in her throat. After the party, Hayes and Mia stood on the hospital rooftop, overlooking the city lights. It feels strange, leaving the ICU, Hayes admitted. You're not really leaving, Mia said. Your influence is woven into everything we do here. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I never said this, but I'm grateful for you, Mia. You challenged me in ways I didn't think I needed, and you made me a better doctor and a better person. Mia smiled. You did the same for me. They stood in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey settling over them. Months later, Mia walked through the ICU, observing the seamless teamwork and vibrant culture she and Hayes had built. The mentorship program was thriving, and the staff operated with a level of trust and cohesion that hadn't existed before. She paused at the plaque in the lobby, running her fingers over the engraved words. A young nurse approached her, holding a clipboard. Nurse Manager Johnson, the nurse began. Do you have a moment to review something? Mia turned, her smile warm. Always. As she walked back to the ICU, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The challenges she had faced, the relationships she had built, and the changes she had helped create were all part of a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. This was more than a career, it was her purpose.